Quality as a Driver for Change. I'm Caroline from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and I'm co-chairing this with Jonathan Moyer from the Park Center at Denver University. We have 7 presentations. We will aim to do like a short break in the middle, but let's see how it goes. As a background, we were very excited to submit this session, but it's really hard to get it through and to get enough space and room for discussion. I did a quick scan of the scenario literature of this SSP database, and 2% of the articles feature anything like gender, or sex, or women in the Type 4 abstract, and we hope that for the next literature round this will be higher. Of course, our population projections are in all of these other papers, but papers that are explicit on this topic. So Jonathan will walk us a bit through and set the scene on why we feel that gender should be more broader reflected in any future updates of the SSPs and which kind of work could come out from using the SSPs. And then we'll head over to the first speaker.
Thanks, Caroline. I'll just sit here since I don't think I have any mic, and I won't probably say many things that most of you don't know, but just to set the scene a little bit for us. Gender and climate mitigation adaptation are obviously related issues. This shouldn't be a problematic thing to consider. Gender equality is a cross-cutting development outcome with significant effects on future patterns of socioeconomic development, embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals, among many others as well. And it very much has a clear relationship with climate adaptive capacity. It's not mitigated capacity, but the future kind of challenges adaptation space is really ripe for scenarios that include gender-related dimensions. In terms of SF22, I'm sure many of us are familiar with the kind of development outcomes that are associated with it, but many of these development outcomes are scenarios that could be quantified or could be qualitatively within the kind of space that we all work within for those kind of scenarios for. Gender equality and gender kind of related imbalances have clear effects with health-related energy outcomes, whether indoor air pollution, maternal health, issues of relationships and sexual violence, clear relationships with educational outcomes, which have a direct relationship with future challenges of adaptation related to either enrollment, attainment rates, or quality outcomes, economic poverty / inequality related outcomes as well, whether it's labor participation, unpaid labor, informal labor, poverty or access to infrastructure, clear relationships here as well, and of course within governance frameworks. I'm just presenting a kind of general kind of framework for thinking about how some of these issues may relate to the future SSP space in particular. One thing Caroline and I have talked about is that it might be nice to pursue some sort of shared writing activity with people who are participating in this workshop, with the goal of perhaps leading towards some sort of peer-reviewed publication that could lay out a roadmap for thinking about how gender could be better incorporated within the SSP framework in particular. So if you're interested in that kind of an outcome, please do let us know. This isn't definitive, but it's kind of an early idea as well. As Caroline mentioned, the SSP literature is very poor in terms of its explicit gender representation. This is something it's needed for a variety of reasons to improve this. And then just to reinforce that stronger gender inclusion increases resilience to shocks and has a very direct relationship with future challenges to adaptation, among many other things. So without further ado, to say things that many of you are very familiar with, let's welcome our first speaker.
Yeah. The first speaker is Raya Mutarak from University of Bologna in Viassa, and you have 10 minutes, and we're very much looking forward to your talk that I hope we can project here. Jonathan has kindly agreed to take notes in the discussion online document, where you're all invited also to write down and jot down ideas. That's in the text of the session.
Thank you. So I think I only re-emphasize what Jonathan just saying, so I could also be quicker, because I was just saying why do we need data on gender, and I don't even have answers. How do we get there, actually? So that's sort of just, I would like to put it on the table, how do we get there for discussion. So I think we made a lot of progress on collecting data. If you think in the past, we couldn't even calculate emissions by sector. We can do it, but it's aggregated. Same thing, actually it's not very easy if you think about, if you want to know the number of disaster mortality, we do have some information, but to get the precise number, most of the time, many countries do not have good death registration. So just to say that it's already quite hard to get the aggregated data. When I wanted to know, like, what about, do we have the gender breakdown, consumption behavior at a global scale? No, we don't actually. One has to certainly work a lot on that, go to the household survey, for instance, try to break it down, and we know that consumption, for instance, varies a lot by gender. Can be because it's related to income, can be it relates to behavior and so on. For instance, I guess with meat consumption, for instance, that's quite consistent across the culture that men consume more meat. And someone did a study, this is for the US, look at the reported gender attitude. So if people are more conform to gender role, more traditional, I mean, have more traditional attitudes. And so there's also the correlation. So for women, it doesn't matter much, but for men, it's also the positive relationship. So they consume even more meat. So some people try to explain that meat consumption is also linked with masculinity and such. But just to show you that why we do need the information breakdown by gender. Similar things Jonathan already mentioned also in terms of when we think about vulnerability. So gender matters in terms of exposure is different. Maybe it's based on by occupation, for instance. Certain occupation of men may be engaged more in outdoor activities. Women tend to stay more at home. So exposure to some type of natural hazard would vary. Same as capacity to adapt, capacity to prepare, coping capacity. When we look at and it's not always, and I think this is also important, that we tend to hear that women are more vulnerable to climate change. We have to actually break it down. What do we mean by that? If we think of fatality from floods and from storms or from landslides, for instance, the evidence is quite consistent across countries, actually, particularly across high-income countries. So it tends to be the mortality from these type of events is higher amongst men. But when we think of heat-related mortality, of course, we know that the older population are more likely to be susceptible to heat-related mortality, but more for women, for many reasons, because physiologically, women also sweat less than men. But also, women live longer, tend to live alone, for instance, and that also matters. And why it matters for scenario building, it's not really related to climate change, but I just want to show when we think about, we hear a lot today about how do we have to take into account COVID-19 or Ukraine, same thing. We don't quite have, not even the gender breakdown for the refugee population. I think we can guess because Ukraine do not allow men to leave, right? So men aged 18 to 60, I guess, cannot leave the country. So the population who move out, which is roughly estimated to be 6 million now, it would change the population age structure and sex structure of Ukraine. So for our scenario, we can't even think a scenario only for the war, but has to be how would it affect the fertility future of the Ukraine, the population, and so on. Now, how do we get there? I don't really have the answer, but I just want to throw in some of the things that how we try to get the heterogeneity of the populations as much as we can. I just show you that we don't really have the migration data. It's really hard to get breakdown by gender. So what we're trying to do with Roman Hoffman, so try to get one way to go around this, I think, to try to go to survey data. Microcensus data has been useful, and once we get the migration flow, it's a microcensus, so we can also try to split it by gender. I think this morning when we saw the gender breakdown of the participants, so that's already kind of the good practice, try to collect as much information as we can. I'm the editor of one journal currently, and we're also trying to get, it's not related to scenario building, we're trying to get even the gender breakdown of the reviewer. We don't know this, and my guess it is probably slightly biased, but try to collect as much data as we can. That's it. And then I stop here.
Thank you, Rara. Any direct any clarification questions for Raya or So as follow-up on this data collection, I actually asked for the breakdown by roles of the scenario participants, but that was not available. So it was only available for the participants.
Just a small question, Raya. I'm curious. These are all public data, right? That you try to use, or have you had access to data that are not public, or?
In this particular case, yes, it's publicly available. Though it's a microsensor, so meaning we know individual data, so you would have to apply.
So it's like the IPAMs, what the IPAMs
IPAMs, pretty much.
Thank you.
Okay, good. If there are no further questions right away, I would ask Daniele Malherbe from the German Development Institute to come and tell us about differentiated impacts in India and gender equality. Yes.
Cool. Welcome to everybody also from my side. Thanks to the organizers. It's the first time I present in this community. So very nice. And so what I'll be presenting today is joint work with Johannes Hemmerling, who's also here and will also has the role to answer the difficult questions. And today what we want to present is ongoing work on including gender dimensions into an integrated assessment model and an application to the case of India. So the background of our research is the fact that many integrated assessment models now have started to consider within country inequality, and this has been done in different ways. So, for example, including quantiles or disals at the country level, looking at distributional assumption. So, for example, log normal distributions, and some of them, for example, do this exogenously, others endogenously. And what kind of comes out from this sort of first models is that including inequality is quite important because the optimal climate policy changes a bit also by the inclusion of inequality and in most cases become more stringent. So another related stream of research that is going on is also looking at how to recycle revenues from carbon taxes within these models. And most applications currently look at very general schemes, so for example, per capita recycling. And this is something we also try to address in this work, as many, especially lower and middle income countries, have very high exclusion errors. So if you use current programs, it's very unlikely that everybody can be reached. So this is sort of the background of the inequality module. Now, what we want to do is also to add the gender dimension, and gender is, of course, a critical dimension. It can be considered as a horizontal inequality in comparison to the vertical inequality of income that is usually studied. And this is, of course, in line with many SDGs. Now, as the previous presentation, I'm sure also the future presentation will outline, gender is a critical dimension to understand just mitigation pathways and not just the adaptation side. So, for example, work has shown that women's representation in politics is much better for climate action and it leads to much higher socioeconomic progress. Now, the question is how to best include gender dimension in integrated assessment models. And what we also try to do brief in this presentation is also to look at what are some constraints. And these constraints exist especially if we look at the monetary values. So, for example, when we look at monetary values that are also used in integrated assessment models, some estimates need to use strong assumptions, following also, for example, the literature on poverty and inequality. So, for example, many times income is measured at the household level, so of course you need to assume that the household is distributed equally within the household. And this will show that it can be an important factor. So in a summary, what we want to do with this paper was to look at the effects of climate mitigation policies and the redistribution of the revenues from the carbon tax in three ways. So an equal per capita redistribution, a neutral redistribution, and a targeted redistribution based on the current targeting of the programs. And we want to look at this by gender. And we analyze the case of India. So how do we do it? We link an integrated assessment model, which probably most of you are familiar with, and we soft link it with an inequality module, and I will mainly focus on the inequality module. And within this inequality module, we collect data from the household surveys on values by decile and gender, looking at income shares, consumption shares, saving rates, educational attainment, wealth and capital, and returns to capital. So in a way, we can endogenize the income and the consumption distribution, and looking at, for example, different skill premia and educational attainment, different capital and wealth distribution, and endogenous savings. So we collect all this data, and we then soft link it through this module with the integrated assessment model. So one important thing is, which relates also to problems with gender data, is that, as I said, we collect data by decile and gender, but the problem we have is how to kind of split between gender. So in this case, we use the gender of a household head, so we split the population between male and female household heads. And the reason for this is that for some variables that we use in the model, of course, the variables at the household level. So, for example, expenditures in different categories are collected at the household level. Now, this is sort of a pragmatic view because, of course, there are also some drawbacks. So, for example, in terms of labor, you could argue that you could look at individual sort of wages to make the composition a bit more accurate. But on the other hand, you have many households, especially lower middle income countries, which have own businesses. So it's very difficult to sort of divide also wages between individual male and females rather than looking at the household head. So for this work, we consider the gender of the household head. Now, just briefly, we also consider the case of India, which is also a good context for our research. And the reason is, of course, from an emission point of view, has a very low per capita level of emissions, but of course, very large in absolute terms. In terms of poverty and inequality, we had economic growth which reduced absolute poverty, but inequality increased. More interestingly, we have India represents a case where there are a lot of social assistance programs, and many of these programs are targeted using the below poverty line card, and there's been heavy criticism because of the leakage and the targeting of these cards. So also it's a good case study for looking at more targeted transfers. And then finally, also there are some issues in terms of gender differences. So going to the results, what did we find? So we implement two scenarios. One is based on the current policies, so the red line, and one is based on a carbon tax that starts at $30 per ton of CO2 and then increases at more or less 5%, so more or less in line with the Paris Agreement. What we find when we do not look at gender disparity, so we look at the overall results, we find four main points. The first one is that income in India would increase in line to kind of the SSP projections, and this is because of wealth dynamics and low education convergence. So this is the first result. The second result is that the effects of a carbon tax on the Gini index is quite small. So inequality increases due to climate policies, but the increase is quite small. Most importantly, when we redistribute the revenues on to the people, to citizens, actually inequality decreases compared to the business as usual scenario. So you can see on the red line, you can see that the changes in consumption by decile. You can see that the red line, when we have an equal per capita transfer, especially the lower deciles increase their consumption. But the fourth result is, I think, the most interesting one, is that when we use targeted schemes, so using the current targeting mechanism, actually for the lower deciles, the consumption increases even more. So you can see that the blue line is more than double as the red line. And this is because, of course, you redistribute the same amount of revenues by kind of lower number of households. Of course, this is the average, but hiding the average, we also have that many lower income households are not included due to exclusion errors, but this is something we can discuss later. Now, when we look at the gender dimension of our results, we can see that in some important variables, we do not see that much difference between male and female headed households. So, for example, on the left, you can see the share of expenditure by category. So here we divided between energy for buildings, transportation, and other expenditure. And you can see that between male and females doesn't change that much. But on the right, you can see that actually education, which is a key variable for the model, there are huge differences between the head of the households, whether they are male or female. So you can see, for example, that a large share of female heads of the households, even in higher deciles, have no education, while for males this share is much lower. And this is very important because of the dynamics that I explained in the previous slides. So given this, what do we find? So we find that now you have on the left-hand side, you have how consumption changes. So the loss of consumption, if the bars go down, it means that consumption actually increased by female and male and by type of redistribution. So you can see that for the equal per capita redistribution, so the top sort of graphs, both for females and males, we have a larger increase of consumption, especially for lower deciles. But this is especially higher for females. Of course, for neutral, we don't see much of change. While if you look at the targeted, again, you see that here the consumption increases are much higher than the equal per capita distribution. But again, the increases are much higher for female-headed households. And this is because female-headed households start with a lower income per capita, and because slightly have different consumption expenditure shares. So the model variables actually impact a lot the final results, and generally we find higher impacts for females compared to males. So just to wrap up, because I think I've finished my time, what we've done is to look at how gender is important in looking at just mitigation pathways, and we did an application to an integrated assessment model. We found that some variables that fit into these models are very different between gender, especially in lower middle income countries, and we looked at, for example, I outlined here the education variable. And the other main issue is that we found that, for example, using targeted transfer can drastically change the results. Now, in terms of what we're discussing now in this session, I want to just make 3 points about important thing about using gender disaggregated data and modeling. The first point is whether we should use individual or household level data, and this really changes the results. Of course, at the household level, expenditures level, those can very difficultly be disaggregated, so that's quite a big constraint. Well, on the other hand, we can work a bit better with labor income and wages. So, for example, what do we do with household businesses? But, for example, most importantly, how do we, for example, model labor choices derived from social norms and working? So, for example, we're publishing a paper on multidimensional poverty, where we really find that whether you categorize people that are outside the labor market or are employed based on social norms really changes your results. So how you basically divide labor income has a big impact and depends a lot on social norms. And the last part is also from recycling schemes. We can also better model those. So, for example, all the literature on cash transfer in Latin America, where the money was given to mothers to increase education and health investments for children, that can also maybe be better modeled in these models. I think that's it for me.
Questions on the microdata. First, what is the actual share of households with a female head? And secondly, how did you do the split? Did you first split male-female and then the deciles are within that split? Because then I think the interesting question is how much poorer are actually the households with a female head, and whether all of the difference you're seeing is due to income and not gender, or whether it's part and part.
Can I get this answer, because I forget the numbers.
A variable, so the gender of the household head, and whether there are other differences in the household.
So in terms of share of household, 87% is male-headed households and 13% is female-headed. It's quite similar across the different income deciles. In terms of education, this is a good point. We checked and we use the household head education, but even if you look at the individual education of the people, it wouldn't change that much in terms of education within decile, whether you use the female head or not. But our aim, I think, is to then check different things like what you suggested. For example, now we use the female within the national income decile, while we could also check doing the other way around. Johannes, by the way, if I say something incorrect.
Now, this is just a general comment, thank you. On this concept of head of household, I think it's really a completely outdated and misleading concept. And as a demographer statistician, I'm fighting this for decades and actively trying to boycott it. And in the Austrian census of 91, we put our 5-year-old child as the head of household. And I later learned from my good colleagues in the Census Bureau that they automatically change it. It cannot be children. Well, in the 2001 census, then we put my wife. And they couldn't do anything because they say typically it's the one who has the highest income, but they are also asking for the income. But generally, I'm always teaching in the introductory demography because it just makes no sense. And actually, they now started an increasing number of countries talking about the reference person. You need to somehow have a reference person. But even this is, since you never know who is now the reference person, and I assume in an increasing number of modern, so to say, families, they choose a woman or something. But of course, the economists have not yet observed this. Most of household level expenditure surveys, they still have this outdated concept of the head of household. And I think we need to fight this and do away and really get information about each of the individual household members. Only this, it's important for the gender's perspective, it's important for the children's right, and having a deeper understanding for generally how family dynamics works.
If I can just answer doing some very shameful marketing, we have at our institute a project on multidimensional poverty, and the main value added of this data we have is that the first at the individual level. So we have 95 countries with individual poverty based on labor, health, and education variables, and we find drastically different results compared to the OFI or the general multidimensional poverty index because we use individual level data.
Maybe I have a bit of a way to get out of this. So I have a paper on South Africa, and we don't use the self-reported head of household, but you have this complexity of maybe the household, you have double income earner, right? So that's a double, we call it double-headed household. It's just a name. And then you have, because the context of many countries like South Africa, for instance, you have a lot of context where there's only one woman in the household, and that you really pick the disadvantage compared to only one adult man working in the household. I think one could probably go around that. Not quite a self-defined definition, but tie a bit with that status.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Good idea. Yeah. One more question, I think, for Daniela.
Yeah, this is very quick. I was thinking maybe in the context of India, households where the female is the head probably are like widows. So probably this somehow implies that the families where the head is a female in your sample, maybe they're a bit different from the others. So maybe you can also reflect on this, because maybe of course these are different in different dimensions, not just about the power balance between the genders. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Just to answer this, so you're completely right. So for the lower deciles, female-headed households are poorer than male-headed households, exactly for the reason you did. For the upper, it's also the case, but actually I was expecting the contrary, because usually the literature says that for many female households at higher income levels, it's their choice, so it's for kind of richer sort of females. But we find very similar. No, we don't find that much higher for females. So on the lower income, lower deciles, we find exactly what you said. The higher, it's against my prediction.
I have one
question comment here as well. So in our model, we broke poverty down by age and sex, and one of the drivers that we used was the household question, right? And we work with UN Women for that work, and they have great expertise in looking at the drivers on individual household bases and really understanding the data. We had a hard time with all the things that people are describing, but we also had a really hard time with thinking about forecasting female-headed households as a share of total households. Did you all tackle that as a question, or did you assume the proportions remain the same?
I think, it was the proportion remained the same, right? Yeah, so but that's definitely also a very good point.
On that topic, I just wanted to know whether there is any standard in terms of how do we decide who is the head of the household. I've never worked with that, but I'm really curious to know if like one type of data would use one decision process or the other one would choose another one. So I would just
Yeah, I mean, I think it's especially a problem when you do cross-country comparisons. So for some countries you choose, I don't know, the oldest wage earners. For some you choose the kind of oldest male, and then you don't have that. You use the oldest female. For others it's self-reported. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. But I think it's more than for within country studies. Really can be an issue for cross-country studies, how they collect this information.
Thanks a lot, Daniela. Now I would like to invite Anne Goujon, who will present not on wild species. She changed the topic very very spontaneously. Also on differentiation by gender and democratic drivers and well-being outcomes.
Demographic, not
democratic. Demographic.
But yes, people mistake it. Often do the same. Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this session. So it's a bit background information that I will have here, just saying what gender matters for demographic drivers and well-being outcomes. So what is demography? Demography is a scientific study of changing population size and structures. So we look at people and we look at their characteristics. And their characteristics are many. They are in terms of age. They are in terms of place of residence, whether they live in which country they live, at urban level or at rural level, in which subnational area they live, and sex is part of the analysis of the characteristics that we look at, and other characteristics that are as well very important for demographic behavior, which are education, labor force, participation in the labor force, ethnicity, race, religion, and you have it. There are many of them. A small note, recently, for a long time, I mean, gender and was in demography was only about the sex of the people, so whether they are male and female, and recently in the censuses, you have also questions about other genders, so which is also something that, I don't know if you want to consider it in modeling, but it's something that is there. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is I'm going to show the difference in demographic outcomes for men and women. And for instance, in this graph, we talk about mortality. You see the age-adjusted hazard ratio of mortality between men and women, and the reference being women. And you see here clearly that men have a higher mortality risk than women. And it's about like 60%. Of course, our lifestyle and health factors can explain some of the difference, but because of the difference that you see across these are middle and high income countries. The difference that you see among these countries, it indicates some contextual factors that contribute to gender inequality in mortality in specific settings. So while men live shorter lives than women, at present, women have more actually disabling chronic conditions, which is exemplified on this graph with arthritis, but we could take other disabling conditions. On the other hand, men have more lethal conditions, which is shown here, for instance, with the case of heart disease. So one sex cannot be characterized as having more better health, and male and female are in health. The differences in health highly depend on as well on historical time and on contextual factor, which I've not seen on this graph. Something that is not so well known is that there are also different fertility outcomes for men and women, which you think it might be difficult to imagine because you need a man and a woman to have a child. So male fertility can be both higher and lower than female fertility, as you can see here from the ratio of male to female TFR. This is different across these different world regions that are here, so mostly global north, and the fluctuations between these. And what you see here is that in the recent period, male fertility seems to be lower than female fertility, and the main cause is related to age differences at the time of having a child between partners, and differences in postponement behavior. Something that might resonate more with participants to this conference is the difference in migration outcomes. Here also there are very important temporal fluctuation, as you see here from this graph. At the present, at the level of macro region, it is quite balanced. You have a slight presence of male migrants in the global south, and a slight higher share of female in the global north. The only outlier where the gender balance is not so obvious is in Asia, where 42% of the migrants, the stock of migrants, are actually male. And this is shown again in terms of migration flow, so the difference, not only the stock, but the people moving between 2015 and 2020. This is research based on Gayable and Joel Cohen research. And you see on the left-hand side, you see the female migration flows. The male hand side, you see the male migration flows. And at first sight, there doesn't seem to be a difference, except again for this Asian part, where the corridor from South Asia to West Asia is clearly male dominated. So differentiation by gender is not the same actually as a demography at gender, which looks more at the role of power, the socially constructed nature of gender, and women's role and position in the society has been shown to be key for several parameters, for instance, related to their own well-being, own health, but also for that of their family, of their children, and also, as we know, in relations to climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies and so on. So women's role position in the society, what is often called as women's autonomy, is actually very difficult to measure. So, it is a composite. It can be composed of many indicators, which are quite hard to measure. So often, what is done is that is used is education as a proxy for this measure. Which is, it has been shown that education is actually very well measuring women's autonomy and is a factor of heterogeneity. Also, what more important about education, and that's why also in the modeling of population at IASA we integrate education, is just more than a proxy. It also indicates empowerment in the population, not only for women but also for men and the whole society. So how has this changed in the recent past? These two graphs are comparing the female to male ratio of population with upper secondary education from 1970 to 1990, from 1990 to 2010 in two graphs in different macro regions. And it shows improvements over time. It shows, for instance, that there's less imbalance in many countries in the world, in many of these regions. There's, however, a disbalance in favor of women. So, like in some areas, in some regions, especially Latin America and the Caribbean, but also in Europe. There are more women aged 25 and higher that have upper secondary than male. And these are different explanations for that. We can go into this if you want later. And the other thing that we see here is Africa is still lagging behind, although there has been progress. There is progress there. So these are, of course, repercussions for demographic, for population projection outcome. And I'm going here to show a few of these based on the global projection, the construction that are done using the SSP. One is the role of migration, which is important to consider. And here we see, for instance, in the case of this country, which is Mayotte, that there is clearly some young men that have left the country looking for employment, so labor migration. Some of them are low educated. They are going to Réunion. Some are highly educated. They go to metropolitan France. So clearly indicated a potential brain drain, which is important to consider for the projections. Another one where it matters for projection is that, of course, of what I talked about of health and mortality, where you see, for instance, here the example of Romania, where for the age group 80 plus, you have 64% are women, and this is already very present in the age group 65 plus, where 58% of women, 58% of this age group is women. The education gap that I mentioned in sub-Saharan Africa is also shown here, where, for instance, 71% of the 20-39-year-olds in the country of Guinea-Bissau, a small country in Western Africa, has no education, are women. Sorry, the 71% of the 20-39-year-olds with no education are women, with implications for the future, because these women are outside of the schooling, and so they will never get an education, meaning that they will stay uneducated unless you launch a big adult education program, which is very expensive. So you have to count on these women to be there for long years to come, which is important for the projections. Now, to finish, about what are the implications in terms of well-being outcome. At IASA, we have developed a new indicator called Years of Good Life, and Wolfgang Lutzer is here. It's his project based on his ERC grant, which is a composite indicator measuring the number of years that an individual would live, implying survival, in good health, out of poverty, and with some basic education and basic life satisfaction. And on this graph, you can see how it differs between men and women, so women on the left-hand side and men on the right-hand side, in 3 countries from 1995 to 2015. And it's quite interesting to see that, first of all, the years of good life are in these 3 countries, especially in India and Mexico, are higher for men than for women, and also in terms of change that has happened in the last in these 20 years of observation. Then men have increased their years of good life more than women in India and Mexico, and it's particularly due to the population who is out of poverty, which is which is growing faster for women, and which might be correlated with the life satisfaction of these people. And I think I will stop here. This was just a snapshot, and I hope there will be enough information to spur discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I wonder if you have any comments on, because the data were at the national level. Do you have any comments in terms of, and I was in particular interested in the differences, or let's say reducing gap in education between men and women at the national level. Do you have any comments at the sub-national level? Because there is a lot of heterogeneity especially in developing countries. So I wonder if you develop this part. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So at IASA, we've developed, so not at the global level, but we have some case studies that are done looking at. So we have Samir Casey, who is not here. I think he's not here, but he has looked at these subnational differentials in India, in Nepal, and in other countries, and showing exactly as you say. So of course there are, especially in low-income countries, there are huge differences in education, at the territorial level. And this has also implications. So taking these differences has also implications for population projections. Because if you take into account this granularity at the level, then you will arrive at different projection results. Because then the weight of each region, each particular subnational area will change in the global projection, and there will be implications. So this is also very important. So the next round of projections, where we try to do, so at the moment we are updating the SSPs, as was mentioned this morning, and it's the same. It's at national level by education, age, sex, and education. But we aim at, in the next version, to at least have urban and rural areas. So that would already give some sort of heterogeneity. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Super.
Thank you, Anne.
Okay. Thank you.
So I guess we have now all seen that, yes, we need more sex-aggregated data. And now in the second part, we will see how gender equality or gender inequality is linked to mitigation efforts and adaptation efforts, I believe. And I should have looked at the program. I think Mathilde will start off. And for those of you who maybe have time to look at the online materials, I look forward to the discussion following Mathilde's talk.
How does the new presentation that was sent last week that you have?
Let's see. If it's not, we can still change it. Does this look okay? Okay. Good. So Mathilde from the University of Leeds. Good luck.
Hi, thank you. So the main question, I'm assuming the mic, yes. So the main question we asked was, how does gender equality relate to environmental performances of countries? The idea was to look at the links between SDG number 5, gender equality, and SDG number 13, climate action. So I conducted this research alongside Chris Smith, IASA, and Jonali Patchery. The main conclusions were that the relationship between gender equality and environmental performances is actually quite contextual and multifaceted. There are multiple interactions between gender equality and climate change mitigation, which are masked by disregarding situated gender constructs, understanding gender as binary, and positing women as a homogeneous group. There is a need to integrate radical gender theories within climate change science through interdisciplinary research and epistemological pluralism to unveil this multifaceted interaction. So that are the main conclusions. I'm going to walk you through the path we took to arrive to this. So brief overview, we're going to go into like the methodological considerations, the results, the recommendations, and then open the floor to discussions. So first, the rationale was that there was a lack of feminist epistemology and gender theories in climate change sciences, the radical gender paradox. The first idea was to integrate gender equality into greenhouse gas emission scenario building and create a scenario of perfect gender equality to be tested in a simple climate change model. However, after careful consideration, we realized that there was a lack of feminist epistemology and gender theories in climate change science that was hindering results. So we decided to address this radical gender paradox. It's a term that explains how gender mainstreaming de-radicalized and simplified gender, resulting in passing out biased and harmful assumptions into the literature, but also in subsequent recommendations and policy responses. So we decided to ask this question in the first place: how does gender equality relate to environmental performances of climate change? And to answer this, we elaborated a mixed method protocol analyzing relationship between three indices, coupled with in-depth interviews with gender climate nexus experts. And I think maybe I'm one of the only person here with some kind of qualitative data. The goal was to answer the question, and yes. So For the statistical analysis, we established 4 key hypotheses that are detailed in the results, so the results will see each hypothesis answered. Thanks to this, we tested correlation between 3 indices, the Global Gender Gap Index, the Gender Inequalities Index, and the Environmental Performance Index, as well as some selected sub-indicators of these indices. And for the interviews, we selected the interviewees using purposive and snowball sampling, and we collected data from certain interviewees with varied cultural backgrounds to conduct out in-depth, semi-structured interviews. I followed the feminist protocol for my interviews. I established rapport, and I let the interviews take the lead, respecting their opinion and what they deem important to tell me. So then the interview's content was analyzed using classic semantic analysis, and I think we are going on to results now. So first, very quickly, we'll go into the statistical analysis, and you'll see the hypothesis, and then we'll go into the interview analysis, knowing that the interviews analysis are integrated in the statistical analysis answers and comments. So the first hypothesis was increased gender equality correlates to the environmental performances of country. And you can see in this figure, where in blue are the correlations between the GGGI, so the Global Gender Gap Index, and the EPI, and in green the correlations between the GII and the EPI. The color code will be the same for all the following slides. So what's expected from the indices was just confirmed. The GGI ranges from 0 to 1, so the blue one ranges from 0 to 1, hence positive correlations. The GII in green ranges from 1 to 0. So 1 is the worst and 0 is the best. So that's why we have a negative correlation here. So at first glance, you can see that this strong correlation could just push you to draw a quick conclusion. Gender equality does relate to the environmental performances of countries. However, when these were presented to gender climate experts, their reaction was that the data wasn't detailed enough in these indices to truly imply any kind of causation, and that there could be a strong possibility that reverse causality is actually shown here. So what we did is that we split the data by region. Income region, so you have low income, lower middle, upper middle, and high. And when you divide it like that, you can see that the correlation only holds in higher income countries. It was also that tested the relationship between gender equality and environmental performances contextuality and influences by countries' national affluence. The lack of correlation for low-income countries is partly explained by lack of data in these countries. Middle-income countries reveal some interesting subtleties, and because depending upon the index, can see that there is either a strong correlation or no correlation at all. So that also questions how the indices were currently using, their construction, and the kind of indicators they aggregate. The strong correlation between GII and EPI in lower middle-income countries, so the one we have here, was justified by gender mainstreaming within funding bodies, and so gender becoming something to be done within development plan. There you can see the evolution over time. So again, that's quite interesting in terms of gender mainstreaming within the funding bodies. And I'll happily go back to that later. Then finally, we tested. Not funny, for much last. We tested gender equality if gender equality influences the specific climate change indicators of greenhouse gas emission per capita and greenhouse gas intensity of GDP. And so we have the climate change indicator here. No, you cannot see my slide, but first is the climate change indicator. Second is the greenhouse gas emission, and the last one that is completely correlated is the greenhouse gas intensity of GDP. That gives an interesting perspective with the absence of correlation between gender equality indices and the greenhouse gas intensity of GDP. It is revealing of something that is, according to experts, that was something that we still need to do, is about women's absence from decision making that actually drives the greenhouse gas intensity of GDP. And finally, we tested correlations between the EPI and the 2 sub-indicators of the Global Gender Gap Index. So the one looking at economic empowerment of women and the one looking at political empowerment of women. And what you can see is that you still have a correlation, but it's extremely weak. And the idea here is that there is a long way to go before achieving any kind of true gender equality in the economic and political domains. We're still really lacking that. The second thing is that women are not some kind of expected panacea to solve the climate crisis, and they should not be considered as such. The idea that gender equality would increase the environmental performances of countries is misleading. The dynamics that were misleading in the sense that it's a very seducing idea, but it doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen, and we have no data to prove that currently. What was interesting with the interview results was that they revealed a lot of methodological issues and progress. So first, as I said before, the lack of gender theories integration in research, the fact that gender mainstreaming led to gender studies being an add-on. So usually when you have gender, it's just a little bit of a plus. It's rarely considered at the root of a project, even though there's a lot of progress on that. And obviously, sex-segregated data is extremely useful, but it also has a lot of limitations in the sense that first, it doesn't consider anything outside of binary constructs most of the time. And as we've heard a lot already in this room, there's a lot of it that is missing in many places, and also there's simply disaggregated data, not just looking at sex-segregated data, but also disaggregated by other social factors. So there are some implications for policy. One of the issues that gender mainstreaming has de-radicalized the notion of gender and our understanding of it, usually ignoring the root causes of gender inequalities, and that bleeds into the way we conceive gender equality policies and interventions, and that results into the exclusion of certain groups of individuals from policy making. I'm going to go into recommendations. I'm just going to go back on the previous slide for a sec. So there's a lack of gender theories and feminist epistemology integration in the gender climate nexus, and that can perpetuate gender biases in both academia and in policy spheres. There was just one thing that I wanted to add was, another thing is that there's a lack of practicality in gender research, with a lot of funny examples that I'll be happy to share with you after. In my research, I had some experts. But that will all lead to our recommendations. So what we built first was a methodological framework. So if you want to, I can pause on that for a minute for you to look at it, but after this is going to be published and you're going to be able to look at that for a while. The idea here is that it's designed for novice gender climate nexus researchers, and it presents an entry point into the complex notion of intersectionality and epistemological pluralism. It's a clear call to promote epistemological pluralism. So the final thing are the recommendations for policymakers. So people willing to inform policy within their academic work. There's four main themes that arose from interviews with gender climate nexus experts. The first one was listening, not only to experts, but pretty much to everyone. So that is a big call for participatory research that is quite often lacking. There's a lack of means as well, obviously. And listen to groups of people that are marginalized from decision making currently. That could lead to a lot of learning that we are currently lacking or just depriving ourselves from. And finally, if we listen and learn from each other, there's this idea that we will be able to radicalize our idea and solutions as well, and integrate not only technical solutions, but also a lot more of the social and individual solutions to climate change. That obviously necessitates a repoliticization of our societies, and hopefully that is something that is ongoing. And finally, there's a real need to refocus the available data, notably considering different ways to measure prosperity, and also to enable intersectional studies by generating multifactorial databases. So, as I said, not just disaggregated data, but disaggregated data in general, while still continuing compilation of sex-segregated data regionally, even locally, and in order to allow for continuous learning feeding into the virtuous cycle. I could be discussing this for hours and hours, so I suggest we finish here. So I welcome any kind of questions. Here are the references, as well as I'm going to keep on the data availability, so you can check everything that was run here on GitHub if you're familiar with that.
I was just very curious about one of the last points you made about the need not just for gender disaggregated data, but kind of more disaggregated data as well. And I'm curious, like, what's driving that need, and if you'd like to elaborate. Thank you.
Well, I think there's a need to not only look at gender, but having more of an intersectional approach. So having also data that is disaggregated by ethnicity, age, class. You usually have age, class, income, education, but there's a need as well to have more about ethnicity and to have maybe this data available in one place. That would be a dream.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm really sorry to ask you a quantitative question.
Go, it's fine.
I just want to know whether also you did some analysis, not just looking at correlation, but also, for example, fixed effects, just to kind of control for invariant characteristics. I know that Marina did a paper on that. So maybe I don't know if you did also some further analysis on that.
Yeah, there's a lot more analysis that was done. It's all available in GitHub. So if you wanna take a look at it, there was a lot of control that we did. We used as well like different indicators to look at them as well, and to look if like things were replicating across the board. And we looked at all the different indicators. There's been tests all over the place. Took me a good 3 months.
I think I missed who you interviewed, so maybe could you just say that again?
So I had certain interviews. A couple of them will remain anonymous because it's their rights. But amongst other, I've interviewed Ingrid Dunkelman. So I've interviewed a lot of the women that were in Rio and looking at gender in Rio. I've got a full list, and I'm happy to give it to you later.
So are there like politicians?
So they're academics. Some of them are also now politicians. They're working into international politics, academia, and they're all experts about the gender-climate nexus. So all of them had at least a bit of research background to be able to just look at the data as well first.
I wonder about your point on de-radicalization of the gender theory. I find that maybe there are two separate communities in a sense. Also, there are many people who probably work on gender quantitatively and also use theory, but not the radicalized theory. The sort of, you probably, in demography, we look at female empowerment and how it changes fertility, but it doesn't have to be a radical theory. So do we need to de-radicalize the radicalized theory or not for the SSP, for instance? Do we need that?
Well, I think the term radical here is the idea of really it's the Latin etymology. So it's going back to the roots of the theories. And the roots of the gender theories are unfortunately often ignored, and that's how we end up looking at gender being male versus female. Whereas we know it's not exactly a binary construct, and there's more and more, as Anne said in her last presentation, there's now inclusion in some data of other genders, and so that can be, for example, one of the entry points when we talk about radicalizing, re-radicalizing, and reintegrating these theories. But it's also about looking at feminist epistemology when studying gender, just because when it comes to more on the ground, and I think that is very relevant rather for mitigation too, but for adaptation especially. When you do on-the-ground research and you're getting survey data, maybe even if you're going to analyze it quantitatively, the way a survey is going to be done and executed with the person answering it actually really matters, and that's something that you don't come across unless you look at the feminist epistemology. And so the way questions are administrated to someone actually matters on their answers, and that is a way that bias is introduced into data, is to have, for example, interview bias. And so that where it gets quite interesting to go back to these kind of theories that have been diluted for a good reason. They've been diluted because gender needs to be considered, and we're not talking about gender. It's something that might not have happened 15 or 20 years ago at all. So there was a point in that, but unfortunately we need to go back to the roots of the theories in a way, when doing gender. Does that answer your question?
Okay, one last question because in view of time we have to then move on.
Thank you. It's a big question. Yeah? So I'm familiar also with the Gender Peace Index, that where higher gender equality means less war and less interstate violence and so forth. Could you say something about your understanding of why this is the case, that greater gender equality would result in less environmental damage? Is it a cause or is it an effect, or both?
I think it's neither a cause nor an effect. And I think there's a lot about, in such cross-country regression analysis, with these aggregated indicators, I think it's nice to see that. It's nice to see that correlation, and it can lead you to think that maybe it's a cause. I think it's neither a cause nor an effect. I think there's multiple interactions between the two. So gender equality is something that has been proven is participating to economical development. And so countries that are more developed or have had higher economic growth in the past 30 years have also been the ones that have been more emitting, and they are today the one putting out more stringent climate policies. So they benefited from gender equality early on, and they are now just jumping on board maybe before the people on that train. So I think there's that, but there's many more other interactions between the two, and I don't think we have the data to know all of these interactions.
Thanks a lot. I will follow up on the fun anecdotes later during the reception that you teased. So now we will have a video by Osprey Lake from UC Davis. Is Osprey online? She's online, great. So she will be available for questions and answers. Okay, so that's oh wait, and I play her already. Sorry. Okay. You will play it. Okay. Well then, that's nice.
No, you'll go ahead and play it on your side, yeah?
Yeah. Okay.
Super. Thank you. Good to be here with all of you. Thank you. Hello. It's an honor to be participating in this gathering with all of you and to be part of this workshop with this esteemed group of panelists. My name is Osprey Oriole Lake, and I'm the founder of WeCan, the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. And in recent months, I've been working as a research affiliate for Maud Lab, the Digital Humanities Laboratory at UC Davis. Presently, millions of women globally are dedicating themselves to climate action and to the well-being of future generations. I make this presentation with great respect for our collective work. In particular, I'm thinking of Indigenous, Black, and Brown women, women from the Global South, who not only are experiencing the most severe impacts of the climate crisis, but they are also often the leaders of the most important climate solutions, like Nima Namadamu, who is reforesting damaged lands and protecting old-growth forests in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Patricio Galinga of the Sadiaco people in Ecuador, who has fought off extractive industries for decades to protect the Amazon. In this workshop, session 93, we are discussing whether gender equity is a driver of CO2 emissions reduction. And our team has reviewed a number of studies that indicate, yes, gender diversity in leadership is a driver of change. When women are represented in leadership, CO2 emissions go down and conservation goes up. In this talk, I'm first going to review some of the data we found, highlighting the most compelling studies that show women's leadership is a driver of CO2 emissions reduction. Then I'll briefly make the case for why we need to be disaggregating our scenarios to track the projected impacts of improved gender equity in leadership. Finally, I will look towards the state of gender and climate communications in general, drawing upon the Women Speak archive compiled and hosted by the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. So first, the review of studies. Our team has found a number of studies that confirm that when women are in leadership positions in companies, governance, and society at large, CO2 emissions decrease and climate action increases. The study we found that seemed to have the most application for scenarios modeling is a 2019 study from the journal Sustainable Development, in which researchers used panel data from a sample of 72 countries between 1971 and 2012. The study shows that a 1-unit increase in a country's score on the Women's Political Empowerment Index is associated, on average, with a 11.51% decrease in the country's CO2 emissions. The Women's Political Empowerment Index is an analytical tool developed by the VDEM Institute. It measures 9 indicators that it breaks up into 3 subdimensions. There is the Women's Civil Liberties subdimension, which includes women's freedom of movement within the country, freedom from forced labor, property rights, and access to justice. Then there's the women's civil society participation subdimension, which consists of women's freedom of discussion, participation in civil society organizations, and representation in the ranks of journalists. Finally, it includes the women's political participation subdimension, which includes legislative presence of women and political power distribution by gender. The WPI drew upon evaluations by 2,600 local experts in assessing each indicator by year and by country. The research compared the emissions data to the WPI data from these 72 countries, 46 countries from the Global South and 26 from the Global North. Their baseline results found out that, quote, women's political empowerment has a significant negative association with CO2 emissions, end quote. Specifically, while holding all other variables constant, they found that a 1-unit increase on the WPEI index leads to a decrease in CO2 emissions of 11.51%. As part of their robustness checks, the researchers controlled for urbanization, economic globalization, and democracy. They also tried excluding countries that are statistical outliers, and the results remained consistent. Overall, including the 11.51% drop in emissions, there are several noteworthy findings from the study. All 3 subdimensions were found to make a difference. Women's civil society participation was found to be the biggest driver of emission reductions, followed by political participation, followed by civil liberties. Over time, however, they included that the 3 subdimensions reinforce each other. If we lose one, we lose the others. Even in the short term, the researchers found that women's civil society participation significantly reduced CO2 emissions at the 10% level. However, the significant 11.51% emissions decrease is associated with a long-run coefficient, meaning conditions of gender equity in leadership must remain stable over time to achieve this result. Gender equity must happen at a deep systemic societal level to ensure long-term transformation and inclusion if we want to see significant reduction in emissions. This, however, isn't the only study we found highlighting the impact of women's leadership. One study we examined found that female representation in national parliaments across 91 countries correlates with more stringent climate change policies and lower carbon emissions. Another study we looked at found that firms with more women on the board and or in leadership positions are less often sued for environmental infringements. Likewise, Yale survey data found that women in the United States are more likely to express concerns regarding climate change than men and are more likely to support policy measures to curb CO2 emissions. This is just some of the quantitative evidence we reviewed that indicates that disaggregation for gender diversity in leadership would improve the predictive capacity of our models. Extrapolating from this evidence, we can also conclude that when women are included in decision-making processes, it is more likely to lead to more ambitious climate policies. In the past, gender has only been included regarding climate impacts. Clearly, from these studies, gender needs to be included in future scenarios as a driver. Based on the studies we've shared, disaggregating for gender would improve the accuracy of our scenarios by incorporating these new data, which are statistically significant and currently missing from our scenarios. Treating gender as a driver would improve and provide policymakers with further understanding of why efforts to improve gender diversity are essential for keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Furthermore, including gender as a driver would also bring awareness to the intersection between the struggles for gender equity and climate justice. Looking beyond the scientific models themselves, we might explore how efforts to improve gender diversity and equity in climate discourse may ultimately aid the efforts to mitigate anthropocentric climate change by amplifying the many strategies and solutions offered by women leaders at all levels of governance and decision-making. At this time, the voice and rights of women often continue to be suppressed and excluded in climate discourse. As of 2018, only 20% of authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, were women. Also, preliminary studies tell us that women are less likely to be interviewed in the media as an expert or decision maker regarding climate. Such research is very difficult to find, highlighting the need for more data on this gender gap in climate communications. So, thus far in this presentation, we have focused on quantitative analyses that demonstrate the important role of women's leadership in reducing CO2 emissions and the current gender gap in climate communications. And now I would like to take a moment to share with you some qualitative materials. The Women's Speak archive, compiled by the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, offers the world's largest archive of stories and media documentation of women climate leaders, highlighting women around the world who are implementing successful solutions and providing critical analyses to address the climate crisis. These stories may be treated as case studies of the way women are at the forefront of climate action. Women Speak, Stories, Case Studies, and Solutions from the Front Lines of Climate Change is a web-based research database and initiative designed to shift the narrative as we collect and share thousands of stories and media narratives by and about women leading struggles and solutions for climate justice under 14 cross-sectional themes, from women's leadership in forest and biodiversity, protection, to indigenous rights, to renewable energy advances, from fossil fuel resistance to climate policy, from new economies to water protection, women are leading the way. To summarize, today we reviewed evidence that supports the inclusion of gender as a driver in predictive climate data, models, indices, and future scenarios. Drawing upon the latest scientific data that connects women's leadership and emissions reduction and also looks towards the qualitative evidence that we have compiled as part of the Weekend Women's Speak archive. Looking at the scientific evidence and the lived experiences of women worldwide, we see that when women are in leadership positions, CO2 emissions decrease. This is statistically significant, and this is why it is essential to disaggregate for gender as part of the scenarios. Here are the citations and my contact information. And with that, thank you very much for your attention to this critical matter, and our team looks forward to workshopping with all of you. And please feel free to reach out to me using the contact information for any and all questions or on the IIASA Connect platform. Thank you.
To Osprey directly, who thank you very much for joining early in the morning. Matilda.
Hello, everyone. I hope. Okay, good.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because you made a really interesting point about having, how gender equality drives lower CO2 emission. Do you think that we should not only communicate about gender equality, but also about inclusive governance in general, and not just gender?
Absolutely. I think that what the study shows is that, we need to disaggregate our data in general, and so I agree it could be in other sectors as well. I'll just mention one that I'm also familiar with in addition to gender, which is Indigenous peoples, and the fact that 80% of the biodiversity left on Earth is in the lands and hands of Indigenous peoples. And so I think that would be another important factor if we are going to continue to look at, as has been discussed in the scenarios conversations, at historical responsibilities to marginalized communities. I would add not only gender but also Indigenous peoples.
Okay, thank you. Further questions to Osprey? Yeah, Wolfgang?
Thank you. Very interesting. You made a convincing case about the impact on CO2 emissions, but can you say a few words about the mechanisms that at least you think this is? Does it mean that there are less travel or more solar energy or or less heating or different kind of heating? So what are the mechanisms by which the CO2 emissions are being reduced?
I think that the key factor here, and also I speak from lived experience in the field as someone who runs an organization where we work with women and gender diverse leaders, both at the highest levels of government and business and grassroots leaders on the ground leading projects for mitigation and adaptation, is I think overall what we can't leave out are things that are more challenging to actually identify quantitatively. And these are factors that do have to do with social issues and the fact that women are caretaking for their families. They are responsible for caretaking for their children, for the elderly, for the sick. They also, through the fact of gender inequality, have experienced the harms from environmental degradation and the climate crisis more severely. And as a result, their concerns and their care and their understanding of care for their communities and their families leads them to different decision making. So I think that while in fact maybe we could look at, are they traveling less? Or are they being more careful in how they're acquiring consumer goods or things like that? I think those are things that we can look at. I think that we can't ignore the straight-ahead social factor of the concern that women have for current and future generations and how that's impacting their decisions.
And I'd like to hop in there as one of the co-authors on this paper as well. And thank you, Osprey, for that excellent answer that kind of breaks down or works to break down, how we tried to make sense of some of the factors we were looking at, but with like the Levendang 2019 study, they were looking at 9 indicators across 3 indices, so she kind of listed those up there. My jet-lagged brain can't recite all of them off the top of my head, but it's like the Political Empowerment Index, has a set of indicators. The Civil Liberties Index has a set of indicators, and then it's measured by, a set of local experts per country. So that 1 point increase on the Women's Political Empowerment Index, is associated with a set of factors and a set of assessments that could always be improved, with every aspect of the scenarios. We could always use more data on everything, but it offers a framework that, is measurable and does have a level that we can, that we can assess. So.
Thank you. It's really fascinating. First time that I've really heard about this, so I really want to know more about it. I was just wondering, how do you make sure that this is not a correlation and this is actually linked to other factors? I know you excluded quite a lot of other possible factors, but can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I can already hear the next discussion, someone saying, oh no, it's just a coincidence. So what do you answer when someone says it's just a coincidence?
Right. It's interesting, like looking at each of the studies, that we looked at, like the second one she mentioned that was just looking at women in leadership position across 91 countries. when you go into the robustness checks, you find that the number becomes zero when you're looking at the difference between the correlation between women and the policy that's decided. Like, with that study, it's because the women are making policy. It's not simply because those women are in leadership positions and it's changing views or something. But that one was only looking at women in leadership positions and in parliamentary positions. Whereas the Levending 2019 study, was looking at factors across society. They controlled for, a number of factors that seemed to, I guess you would have to look at that study and kind of break it down and have those conversations with the authors themselves. But, we were convinced. And we're curious, and we want to hear more. We want to workshop that with you all. So.
And I would just add, just really quickly, that I think that the Levending study did quite a bit on their robustness checks to ensure that that it wasn't just sort of circumstantial, as you were suggesting. And also, I think that in addition to the robustness checks that they did, they also really removed all the statistical outliers. So I think they did quite a thorough investigation into ensuring that this wasn't just sort of happenstance. And I would also just encourage you to look at the study, which is quite thorough.
I've got one more question, if that's okay. Aren't you afraid that putting the focus on gender equality and driving such stringent environmental policy will lead to some kind of pass-by effect, or how do you say? Sorry, I've lost the normal expression. I've got it in French, if someone can translate. Passager clandestin? Free rider, a free rider effect. So you're going into saying, gender equality drives environmental performances. What happens if men don't get engaged on that question? If other gender do not get engaged, if people just consider women will be the drivers of change, what happens to the rest of the population?
So I just want to clarify. I think you have a really good question there, and I want to make sure I really understand what you're saying. So if women are the key drivers of carbon emission reductions and leading on these issues, then others will not participate as well? Is that what you're suggesting? I just want to make sure I understand your question.
Well, that's like what I was saying. Pushing the kind of narrative, saying, gender equality will kind of like is driving changes. Isn't that narrative that's shown in studies as well? Isn't it coming from certain kind of assumptions first, but also doesn't that lead to indeed the free rider effect that you don't want?
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. Okay, sorry. I just thank you for clarifying. In my observation, both on the ground and advocating at UN climate talks, my observation, and also just from these studies that we've seen, is that when the women are leading and are making these decisions at a political level or leading projects on the ground, that they tend to pull everyone in the entire community along with them. So I don't think it's so much that there's a free rider effect, so much as that they are driving a demand in the climate emergency that we're in to have everyone's participation, because what we have seen is that women work in community and women work collectively, and I think that's also why we see the results we do when they're in leadership roles and the carbon emissions are going down. Is I don't think they're operating singularly, I think they're working collectively, and that's why they're gaining the results that they are.
So, hi Osprey, thanks for your presentation. You had said that women are leading the way, and I'd like to put another statement alongside that, not to deny that that's what's happening, but another statement that reflects my understanding of what might be happening. the underlying mechanism of why women in power or women's equality would lead to these effects. And that statement is that women and men together are gradually containing hegemonic hypermasculinity, narcissistic hypermasculinity, with beneficial effects for both society and the environment.
Thank you for the statement, which very nicely sums up the notion of this session, I think, also. Thank you, Osprey, for being with us. We will now go to the next speaker, Maria Andrievich.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say in closing, I really hope that with all the effort everyone collectively is doing on this topic, since I'm not there with you physically and I won't be able to workshop and talk to you directly, and I'm so glad my co-authors are there to discuss this with you. I just wanted to close by saying I think this is essential that we really bring gender into the scenarios. I think that if we leave that out, we're really not going to be producing the best result we could for really the kinds of outcomes that we're looking for in the scenarios modeling. So I just really want to encourage everyone to keep going with the great work everyone's doing. This is really an important topic. Thank you, and have a great session. Thank you.
Thank you, Osprey. Thank you. So now, Marina on All Brains in Action. So Marina is also from YASA. Thank you, Marina.
As of recently, and as the last speaker, it's always a bit of a tough job, so I'll share also a personal context to this. So I saved this research question for while I was on maternity leave, because I thought that this is going to be so simple to put together that I'll just download the numbers, put them in an equation, and then I'll have the answer to this question, which I was intuitively hoping to find. However, now I wish I allocated a bit more time to the research question. So I wondered what the relationship is specifically between gender equality and gender equality in education more specifically, and innovation measured on the state level, so innovative capacity of societies. And so we talked a lot today about this, and I'm not going to go over some of the things that we've already mentioned, but only that this connection between specifically women's higher education, so university education, and mitigation or innovation in mitigative technologies is largely missing. And now we're discussing why this is, what the mechanisms might be to drive this relationship. And I came from the notion that intelligence and talent are equally distributed in a society. So we'll have our best people on the case to solve a societal issue if we have an equal share of men and women. So nothing particular about women, that they're more caring about this issue or something, but that we have the smartest people on the case if this is equally distributed. So I wanted to look into percentage, the share of women in science, technology, engineering, and math fields as a proxy for women in contributing to the innovative capacity of a society. And here you see that this is that there is a severe gender gap across. Here I just put upper middle income countries, but this holds across all income groups. That in engineering fields in particular, there is a very large gap between male and female participation in this. And I asked two simple research questions. So the first one was whether gender equality in patent applications contributes to a larger innovative capacity. And the second one was whether there's a correlation between gender equality and innovation in environmental technologies, so exactly to talk about this mitigation part. I'm going to skip over the data, so this is just what I had, but I just want to say that my key outcome variable, so how I measured innovation, is this Global Innovation Index from the World Intellectual Property Organization, which factors in 100+ indicators to derive then at the end one number that represents this capacity. And first then I applied a principal component analysis to identify key determinants of this innovative capacity without taking into account gender, so as to know what to control for, so to arrive to as robust effect as possible. And then I did some cross-sectional and also panel regressions to hope to reach as concrete result as possible. However, it's quite complicated, and I didn't find the result that I was intuitively hoping for. So this is, a lot of points. So this is 6 scatter plots for 6 different years for which I had the data, which contrasts this Global Innovation Index and share of STEM degrees held by women. And I don't know if any of you see the relationship here. I didn't, and also this, it was not possible to draw any sort of a trend line here because of, well, here in the middle something happens, and then here there are outliers on both sides. So here we have countries such as Colombia and Brazil that have the highest share of women with STEM degrees, and this goes in line with some of the data presented by Anne. On the other hand, we have then we also have countries like, these countries then fare very low on this Global Innovation Index. And then we do have cases that would speak in favor of my results, but nothing that would confirm any sort of a relationship. However, when I look at another piece of data provided by by the same body for intellectual property, they have an indicator on the share of women inventors. So out of all of these patent applications, they have a share of women, and this, and this is a panel regression over 30 years of data or something. Here, this gender equality in inventions has the second largest effect. So here, what this number roughly says is that for every 1 percentage point increase in female inventors, there's 1 point more for this innovative capacity that goes on a scale from 1 to 100. So we leave this for discussion as to what this means, but just preliminarily, this means that education of women per se does not necessarily lead to this being deployed as human capital, particularly for innovation. And then for the second research question, where I hoped to find, and this was really based on my anecdotal observation of a lot of women going into climate science, for example, a lot of female engineers dealing now with climate change issues. I looked at the global share of patent applications in different engineering technologies, and indeed, environmental technology had the highest growth in the share of women, or here, the data is patent applications with at least 1 female inventor, so not an entirely reliable indicator, but still. However, when I tried to look at whether there's a relationship again between the share of female inventors and specifically growth in environmental technologies, this was loosely correlated, but then the effect didn't hold when I controlled for other determinants of innovative capacity, such as rule of law and investment in research and development, which held for the general innovation and share of women. But then there was no statistical significance for women in education and growth in environmental technologies. So again, this broad case. And the question is, why this is. And then, curiously, female inventors and female education are not correlated. Again, if someone sees a trend here, tell me. And then, I would be very curious to hear feedback, but my hypothesis is that there are many barriers to women transitioning from holding a STEM degree to employment in a STEM field and space to innovate and so on. And another thing is, and I think this is an important point for this, I've been listening to all of these discussions, is that less inequality does not mean more equality necessarily. So just because we have more women in STEM fields, it does not mean that we have 50-50. So there's some hypothesizing that some magic should happen when there's really gender equality. But we don't have this as a counterfactual, so we don't know what really would happen. And then there's also relating to the previous point, something called the leaky pipeline phenomenon. So evidence that a significant share of women leave the workforce from the STEM fields. So again, this doesn't translate into significantly larger innovative capacity. And yeah, I also need to mention that data is still a problem, and I had a lot of very unbalanced country year combinations from combining different data sets, so I didn't pursue as many types of analyses as maybe I could have wished for. And also this patent application data is a bit controversial because for this one needs a dictionary of names to then derive how many men and women are there, and this is a bit problematic. So this is very labor intensive and would require a lot of meticulous work to really have a reliable data set. So that's all from me, and I would be very curious to hear some interpretations of this.
So, yeah, any inputs for Marina? Thank you very much, Marina. I start here, you just pass it on.
I thought I kind of see a U shape there. I don't know, maybe you try to see some pattern. But anyway, what I wanted to say, I think there's a lot of endogeneity going on, right? Because, for instance, how many % of inventors do we have in the countries? Probably there's already something different there, and then what you're capturing, I don't know, something's going on that capturing the unobserved characteristics that make a country, that you find some kind of correlation, but maybe...
But here it's fixed effect, so it's like it captures for unobserved country characteristics. I think this result is fairly robust. Yeah.
Okay.
And I tried the same for education, but it just doesn't. If anything, I get sometimes the opposite effect, and yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a hypothesis again, but having looked at this, it kind of convinces me even more that equality in capabilities is only the first step to equality in outcomes. And I think that's what you're very clearly seeing here. You know, I mean, yes, we need more women in STEM, and there's no question about that, but that's not going to lead to more innovation necessarily when you have the leaky pipeline and, you know, all the other barriers to effective empowerment and action in terms of innovation or anything else for that matter.
Well, I think I'll agree with Shonali here. You might have some, more women in STEM, then in their career, are they actually provided with the opportunities that their male counterparts will be provided with, which is a big question, and the answer is probably not exactly. And the other thing as well is, as Shonali said, gender equality goes beyond quotas. It's not just having the same share of women and men in a place. It's also having women that have the capabilities and have the empowerment to be able to actually put themselves in a place of creativity and innovation. And that goes way beyond just having quota, I believe. So I think the data is actually very interesting for that reason.
Do you want to reply to that?
I mean, I can only agree. I wasn't contesting at all, any of these points. This is also I think this education question is interesting because it's not really a quota. We don't have a quota for men and women in education, but yeah, a separate discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I would make maybe a general comment and also related to a question. So I think the temporal dimension plays a very, very critical role as well in
when we look into these processes. And I could imagine that many of these processes take place over a longer time horizon, and this kind of challenges also our empirical modeling in particular. And I don't have an answer to what could be the best solution to basically addressing, let's say, these longer, more slowly moving maybe processes, but I was wondering if you had taken those into account in any way, if you have tried maybe to vary the time scale in your analysis to see if maybe longer time horizons over which the explanatory variables evolve kind of maybe have an effect. And then just a quick second question. You look primarily into environmental innovations. I was wondering if you also looked into as a counterfactual, like general innovations in a society, and if those are related in any way to the share of female inventors. So if you see generally something kind of moving, if more women get into this field. Thank you.
So this is for the general. Going from the back, is answering the easiest question. This is for the general innovative capacity of the society. For environmental technologies are not a field where women have the highest share. This would rather be chemistry or biochemistry, where that would have most women in the field. For the time horizon, fully agree. What goes into here is 25 to 30 years of data, but I'm not sure this is enough to capture really these temporal improvements.
Thanks. I had a question. Thank you for your presentation. I really liked that you brought up the point about equality and it not just being about equality. And I wondered if you had any comment about the difference between equality and equity in terms of your study. As an example, just how I like to just think of it in a really simple way so we're all on the same page is, you might have seen sort of this cartoon that was going around where you see three different people trying to see something over a fence, like it's a baseball game. And one is very tall, the second person is medium-sized, and then there's one person who's too short, can't see anything. And they give everybody a box to stand on, which is equality. Every one of the three people has a box. Now the tall guy is even taller, he sees better. The middle guy can just barely see. The little guy gets the box and still can't see. So that's equality. And then there's the next frame, which you see the small guy gets two boxes and finally can see. The tall guy still can see, doesn't have a box. Now we have equity. And so it's a fairness issue. So I wanted just to sort of, dig into that a little bit with you, because I think there's an issue around equality and equity that we have to look at. And then also it's just not about having, different percentages of women in the room, but it's also about them bringing their analysis, a feminist analysis, their viewpoint and their thinking. It's not just about numbers, but their education background and the view that they're bringing and the knowledge that they bring. So anyways, I would love to hear what you have to say about that topic. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. I would love to have data on equity. Unfortunately, I don't. This is really a quantitative indicator, very much a proportion of something. I have to say I'm not fully convinced Let's put it this way. I do agree and believe that diversity in opinions, in leadership styles, in attitudes does have its value added and probably is beneficial for all. But I'm not sure I agree with this notion that it's because women are more caring, more in touch with nature, is what drives this trend. What I was trying to say is more or less a numbers argument, so that we will have the best people on the case to solve a problem if we've tapped into sort of both, in very binary terms, both sides of the society, simply because this is our best chance to have the best pool of talent. Because I'm afraid that we might reinforce gender stereotypes by arguing for this notion that women are more caring and contribute in this way, for example.
Okay, just as a note, actually, you're not the last speaker because we have a special guest, and so there will be still one video. So for any comments, please super short, because you do want to go to the poster session later on. We still have a video and we still have poster surprise talks. Yeah.
Okay. So I really need two boxes. Yeah, talking about equity versus equality. I just wanted to say there are lots of studies on the U.S. in particular looking to what's happening with women in STEM when they do their career, they start their career, and the fact that they disappear. So there is a lot of literature. I don't know about other countries, but I think it would be interesting to look to that, at least for some case studies, because that might happen.
No, thank you very much. I have to admit I did very little literature review, so I published a paper on gender equality in scenarios before, and I've free-written on what I've read for that, and then just really did some data crunching this time. But thank you. That's a good tip.
Maybe to keep it short in just one sentence, did you also check for regions like South America, for example, because I saw that there was a cluster there with South America, and maybe a control for that might also be interesting. But I pass on.
I go along these lines. So maybe using some factors in like maternity leave length, or so you looked at technological innovation. How about social innovation? Maybe participation in NGOs or something around that could also help.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the regional one as well. I simply didn't get there, but yeah.
We can talk.
I'm missing the next steps slide.
Yeah, my suggestion was to go along the same lines, because what we see in education data is that although women in Latin America are more educated than men on average, we see that there is a big gap in labor force participation. So maybe weighting your data by some of these labor force participation characteristics, and if you have them sectoral, that would be even better to in a way capture this disappearance of women. So they study, they complete their career, they then go to maternity leave, or end up actually in less pay and less let's say less prestigious employment in the end. And this is happening a lot, especially in Latin American regions, and these were exactly your outliers.
Yeah, thanks. Great point.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that maybe also former Soviet Union countries, which usually have a very high tertiary degree of females, but then also staying in the job. So, regional. Okay. Good, then thank you so much.
Thanks.
And we move to our surprise guest. That's a video again. Is he online? Someone is online. Okay, then let's be surprised. Felix Kreuzig finishing up this session. And let's.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very sorry to not be there with you, and I would like to share the discussion over the time, and I would like to present our results on gender equality or inequality and climate action. The main result is that gender equality may be a precondition for effective climate action. The precondition. So let me try to explain, what's the background first. And it's joint work with Marina, who may be in the room today, with Francesca from University of Louisville, from Patricia Perkins, co-author in my team in the FCC report, and especially Angela Ramakrishan from the University of Gothenburg, who did the heavy lifting in the modeling. So, what's the context here? It's coming partially out of our chapter 5 in the most recently published IBSCIL report, which was on demand services and social aspects of mitigation. And we took a social science perspective on climate change mitigation. And of course, that means we took a people-specific perspective and focused on the metric called well-being, like how well-being is actually in alignment with demands like climate change mitigation. And one important subcategory and aspect that we focus on, and Patricia was really the driving force here, is gender inequality. Gender inequality, and you probably know the main staples of that. We know that where there's more gender equality, there's more capacity for climate action in local settings. And we know that more women in parliament means there's more effective climate legislation. That's a strong result already, and actually in the chapter 5 of the Access we reflected this kind of insight. And motivated by that, we wanted to dig a bit deeper into to figure out more statistical analysis on that, also coming from the work of Bovostein, who focused on the quality of governance. So his main result is that we need quality of governance in impartial institutions that create social trust, and that actually in turn creates a condition for good governance. So we took that as also a main background for our analysis, and investigated variables such as social trust, gender equality, and climate action operationalized as the carbon pricing and also university commitments. So, what did we find? The first main result is that there's more climate action, mitigation action, carbon pricing when there's more social trust, and there's more social trust when there's more gender equality. It's income equality and gender equality. Both of them are causally important and underpin social trust. I should mention that it's mostly structural equation modeling, which is behind here as a mode of analysis. We did some additional tests, but it's really based on structural equation modeling. So again, gender equality, higher gender equality means there's more social trust. If there's more social trust, then countries have higher capacity to implement climate measures such as carbon pricing. That's the first main result. Second main result is that there's a loop actually, and that is because there may be issues like basically, if you think about it, climate mitigation effectively means like a complete reordering of the fiscal and monetary system. And for example, in carbon pricing, the main issue is about like revenue distribution, for example, as climate dividend. And if you redistribute the revenue of carbon pricing impartially as a climate dividend per capita, each gets the same lump sum, this actually improves, of course, equality dimension in social trust. And by this actually iterates the possibility for more climate action. There's a loop between equality, social trust, and climate action, depending mostly on the way that revenue is redistributed and the way climate policy instruments are implemented. Okay, so this is the main result. Like obviously, gender equality is important on its own. Is however also important instrumentally for climate action, and this, in a wider context, may justify broader political programs such as the Green New Deal that simultaneously look at climate mitigation, but also and the distributional issues behind that. So these are not only two separate goals, but they're dynamically connected and could also and should be followed simultaneously, and maybe not in a way that outlines very specific groups, but doing it in such a way that's impartial, so that means that everyone feels treated equally to avoid polarization. Thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to also hear back from the workshop session on the results, and we'll follow also the other talks. Again, very sorry for not being able to join.
Is he online on Zoom for questions? Because there's somebody online, but we don't know who it is. So, Felix, if you can hear us. Are there any questions for Felix? there are no questions, then we don't have to find out if he's on then. Okay, it's not clear. No, that's Osprey. That's Osprey. Okay, so then he's not on then. So any questions, please, via email, maybe to Felix or to the discussion document, and then we can get back to him. So I would like to invite now, as a surprise again, any poster presenters who are in the room who want to pitch their posters, either virtually or in person, and then we can all head over to the poster session. Camille, do you want to start? Very short, because you're in between yourself and...
Hello, everyone. I'm Camille Bellemin. I'm doing a PhD at the Potsdam Institute for Social Impact for climate impact research. And since a few months, I've been working together with a startup company. So I'm going to present to you in the poster the work I've been doing with them. And basically, their goal is to bring to the market a new type of carbon credit focused with the goal of financing girls' education. And the idea behind is that education is one of the most important determinants of fertility decline because it empowers girls, it gives them information on their reproductive health, and all of this leads to fertility decline. And so in this project, basically I quantify how much CO2 you could save from ensuring the secondary education of girls, while accounting for the differential energy consumption along education. And the idea is that if this would lead to carbon savings, that would constitute a new way to finance programs that are working with girls' education and to kind of stream climate finance into this. So if you want to know the answer, you can come at my poster and we can talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Camille. Christina, do you want to pitch your poster as well? Sorry, I did not inform the poster presenter, so you have to do this ad hoc now.
Hi, my name is Christina Bradatan, and I'm at Texas State University. So my poster is focusing on a simple question, whether or not migration is buffering the effect that climate change might have on women's status. And I actually came up with this question while looking through the data on Senegal. If you look to Senegal, what's happening in Senegal, it's of interest for me because it's one of the countries where you have high population growth, so lots of vulnerable people, low GDP, relative to low GDP, and then lots of problems with climate and environmental problems. So I looked to the data from the DHS, what's happening with the women's status in Senegal, and it's interesting that it's actually decreasing, which is something that I didn't see for other countries. So I tried to find out what's happening there. I mean, trying to come up with an explanation. And one thing that I've noticed is that Senegal had several floods, significant floods, during, after 2000 especially. So I tried to link, using micro-level data, look to several DHS to see whether or not there is a link at the subnational level between whether or not that region had a flood and the women's status, how it changes. So I found some relationships. I didn't take into account, I need to look more at there is a lack of data at the subnational level, and I asked questions about that because I noticed that. So I need to look to more factors, I guess, to control. But I think I found something. So I think having environmental problems, which it makes sense, it affects the poverty level, right? But then when you look what's the link with the migration, when you look to migration, people have a way out. They already have connections with family outside of the region, and they either receive remittances, that's my hypothesis, or they leave when there is a disaster. So they have a way to, let's say, adapt to climate change, even though this is a poor country. So it's not like, U.S. has a hurricane, there are lots of federal investment there going on. So anyway, that's a short story. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Marina, you are also here.
I don't know. I don't know. Kauho is she?
Yeah, I made a poster based on a paper that we published already 2 years ago actually, which was an operationalization of the gender inequality index, the one that Mathilde also mentioned, called the gender inequality index, in the SSPs. So we have SSP projections of a gender inequality index, and that's simply a presentation of those results.
Thank you all. This is a note of wrap-up. I'll share some notes that'll summarize this, not tomorrow, but probably in a couple of days. And have a great rest of your day. Thank you.